This is so crazy to say that over the past 20 plus years that I've been working with patients, and it came over, I did the calculations, and it was over 15,000 patients that I've treated so far. And I've realized that, sorry, that just blew my mind just thinking back on it. And I realized that after treating all of these patients, and this is just me brainstorming and reflecting back on all these years, that all of their health issues came back to one thing, which was the mitochondria. And so many people that I always say this, but so many people ask me the question, what the heck? One is the mitochondria, what does it do and how do we help that? So I decided to make this podcast episode all about that. Because I remember being back in a seminar, and I think it was about 2005, and the doc that was giving the seminar, he kept talking about how the mitochondria are so important to overall health. And it really didn't spark my attention because I thought I knew everything about the mitochondria, that it made energy. We were told that it was the powerhouse of the cell. I was a cell major and I was a cell biology major in college. So I thought I knew everything about the mitochondria, but little did I know, stepping out of that seminar, that there was so much more. And as time rolled on, as more research came about with the mitochondria, we're finding out, even to this very day, how much more of a role than just making energy in the cell that these little guy does. So welcome back to the show. This is Dr. Mike, and I hope you had a beautiful Mother's Day. Happy Mother's Day to all you moms out there, especially my mom. Whether you're celebrating your mom, you're being celebrated, or reflecting in your own way, that we're diving into something incredibly fascinating with the mitochondria, what we call the powerhouses in there. But because this past Mother's Day, this is what really triggered me to think about the mitochondria, and looking back at how long I've been working with patients, is that all the mitochondria come from your mom. Literally, that's the way that it gets passed down. So in this episode, I wanted to dive in and explore what the mitochondria are, how they influence everything from energy to aging, and some of the top ways to protect and power them up. So if you've been feeling tired, foggy, or out of sync, this one is for you. So I remember when I was in college in my cell biology class, we were sitting down in front of the microscopes, looking into the cells. And after we put in some of the stains, there it was, the mighty mitochondria. And I wasn't really that excited. I was like, okay, whatever. Because we were told that the mitochondria are the power plants of their cells. They convert the food that you eat into energy in the form of ATP, blah, blah, blah. I wasn't so excited about that. But as I got into practice and I started to realize the implications on health that the mitochondria had, and the link to mom, and when we looked at mom's health and grandma's health, how all of that plays a part into our own health, that's when I started to perk up. That's when I was like, wait a minute, we got to look more into this. And as I started to dive more into this realm, I started to find a lot of the researchers and a lot of the research behind it that pointed towards, hey, this may be more than just power plants in the cells. Now, every single cell, except red blood cells, by the way, has them within it. And some cells, like the heart and the brain, they actually have more than the 10 or the hundreds. They have thousands of mitochondria in them. So let me give you a really fast lesson. I wish I could draw this out on the board, but you're listening to this on the podcast. A really fast lesson on how the mitochondria actually make energy. So basically, when you eat food, your body's going to break it down into its components, right? So it'll be a protein, fat, or carbohydrate. Eventually, some of that will get into a different cycle, which then will be transferred into the mitochondria. Now, the mitochondria's currency is that of electrons. Okay. So what happens is within the mitochondria, there's this chain called the electron transport chain that will shuttle these electrons through it. And as it's doing that, it'll pump what's called protons from the inside of the mitochondria into the inner membrane space. And what it does is it creates this proton gradient. That's what it's called. Basically like a dam. So a dam of all of these protons will build up and it'll create this gradient. And then at the end of it, there's this little outlet that allows its protons to flow from the higher concentration into a lower concentration, just like how a dam is working. And with that process, ATP is formed. So now you need a couple things to make this whole thing work. One, you need the electrons to be delivered to the mitochondria. Number two, you need oxygen to be delivered because that's what's at the end of the electron transport chain to accept the electrons. So it draws the electrons through the electron transport chain. And then you also need a well-functioning mitochondria, meaning that if the spaces in between these proteins on the electron transport chain are not at its proper space, it's like an assembly line. If the assembly line is too spaced apart, it's not as efficient. So these little proteins, if they become farther spaced apart, then the electron transport is not as efficient as it should be. So at the end of it, you have this little motor called the ATP synthase. And this motor becomes active when the protons are flowing through it, and it creates ATP. This is basically the reason why you had spies, right? I love spy movies like James Bond, and they would have these things called cyanide pills. And whenever they would get caught, they would take the cyanide pill and they will die. And the reason why is cyanide jumps into that electron transport chain, blocks the electron flow, and basically shuts down your production of ATP. And if you don't have ATP, you die. Now, the crazy thing is that your body, the mitochondria in and of itself, is making tons and tons of ATP every single day, that it dwarfs your body weight in the amount of ATP that it's producing, right? Because your brain, your heart needs ATP. That's why it has thousands and thousands of mitochondria within each of those cells. Now, what really interested me was when I started to hear a lot of the research coming out about mitochondria and how, one, it gets passed down from mother to baby, and how almost every single chronic health issue that we're seeing today has its roots in mitochondrial dysfunction, which then means that if mom's health and if grandma's health wasn't where it needed to be, it gets passed down to babies. And this is one of the main reasons why, like, when people ask me if aging is the number one cause of all disease, then why do babies have diseases of aging? And my answer to that is they're born with mitochondria that have been damaged. And damaged mitochondria is basically signaling an aged process. So the babies actually come out at a biological age that's way older than its chronological age. So this is the problem that we're seeing in society, is that we have a lot of things in our environment that's creating this mitochondrial damage, that's creating accelerated aging, and also what we call mitochondriopathies, or dysfunction of the mitochondria in babies. And it's being passed down from mom to baby. So think of the mitochondria as like the CEO of your body's energy economy. And when your mitochondria is optimized, you feel vibrant, you feel sharp, you feel resilient. Now, when it malfunctions, this is when we start to see issues, because energy production plummets. And what happens in this process, in the decrease of energy production, is you start to see all types of metabolic processes start to break down, especially glucose regulation. This is a really big issue. And also immune function. So whenever I see people who suffer from metabolic dysfunction like diabetes, all kinds of immune dysregulation like autoimmune issues, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, Graves' disease, that all stems from a mitochondrial dysfunction. And you can't reverse any of these things until you fix the mitochondria. So if we try to implement different dietary strategies, but it has nothing to do with helping the mitochondria, you're not going to get anywhere with this. So stuff like multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, even stuff like hearing loss, all has its roots in mitochondrial dysfunction. And if we want to see any type of improvement, even just managing it properly, we need to focus on the mitochondria. Now, some of the telltale signs that your mitochondria are going downhill is when you start to experience fatigue, not being able to recover properly, brain fog, and like chronic inflammation. All of these things actually go overlooked because you don't necessarily think that this is linked to a mitochondrial dysfunction. Now, one major one that I see in patients that I tell them is a telltale sign that these are the beginning stages of a mitochondrial dysfunction is that of dehydration, even when you're drinking enough water. This is the patient that comes in and I look at them and I'm like, I can tell you're dehydrated. We run tests, they're dehydrated, maybe have a higher hematocrit, or even just looking at their skin, they're very dry. You pull on the skin and you can tell the skin's dry. You know that they're dehydrated. And then they tell me, but I drink 3 hydro flasks every single day. And I drink these electrolyte packets every single day. I know that their mitochondria is on the verge of getting into severe dysfunction. Why? Because the majority of the water in our body is actually made by our mitochondria. It's just a byproduct of electron transport chain. So when the oxygen combines with all the rest of the stuff in the mitochondria, the byproduct is water. This is what we call metabolic water. And there's a really good thing about this water, especially when you start breaking down fats more effectively when your mitochondria is working properly. But the really cool thing about this water is what we call deuterium depleted. And I'm not going to really get into the whole deuterium talk because it gets really confusing for a lot of people. But basically, just think of deuterium as like water that's sludgy, like swimming in mud. That's what deuterium is. It's a different form of water. Now, when your mitochondria makes its water or metabolically made water, it is deuterium depleted. So it doesn't have deuterium. So now, if you have deuterium depleted water within the cells, it's basically like all of the things in your cells don't have to swim in mud. It makes things a lot more easy to function within the cell. Now, whenever you have just 2 to 3 ATP decrease being produced by the mitochondria, this is when you start to see the beginning of a decrease in your metabolism. Now, there's a misnomer that says as you get older, your metabolism slows. Hey, I'm in my 40s and it's just I have a slow metabolism. That's why I'm fat and sluggish. No, it's actually your mitochondria are not functioning properly because they're beginning stages of damage. And that's why your metabolism is decreasing. Not just because you're getting older chronologically, you're getting older biologically. So basically what this sets up is an environment in your body to be a perfect place for what we call opportunistic infections. So we have these bugs, per se, that live within our body. And given the right environment, these bugs will then proliferate. And many really don't realize this. But the major parasites that people are seeing or complaining about are actually already living inside of you. And I'm not going to even get into this whole idea of pleomorphism, but you can go look that up on your own time, pleomorphism. So when you have an environment that's catering to these opportunistic infections, when you have a decrease in your metabolism because you drop in ATP production, these opportunistic infections pop up. These may be latent infections that have been hiding in your body for years upon years. This is the person that tells me, I have EBV, Epstein-Barr, and nothing I throw at it will help. This is the person that says, I'm sick all the time no matter what I do. This is a sign that your mitochondria are damaged because of a drop in ATP production and your immune system is now in a state of suppression. And this is why many patients that I start to work with, they tell me when I first start working with them, I've done every single parasitic cleanse, I've done every single diet on the seems to work. And that's because you didn't spend enough time to get the body back to its optimal electrical state. Yes, I said electrical state because the mitochondria creates electrical voltage in your body. So the major roles of the mitochondria, obviously we've talked about this right at the beginning of this podcast, is its major roles is to produce energy in the form of ATP, but it's also playing a big role in the regulation of oxidative stress, free radicals, and antioxidants. And if you don't have this under control, you basically rust faster from the inside out. It also controls calcium signaling, inflammation, and metabolic flexibility, the ability to switch between carbohydrates and fats for energy. Now, let me jump off of the metabolic flexibility part. And I talk about this in my total slim down program. The ability to switch between fats and carbohydrates for energy is very important for longevity because most people get stuck in only burning carbohydrates for energy and they can't ever make the switch over to burning fats for energy. And that's a telltale sign that you're not very efficient in your mitochondria because then the fats goes to the mitochondria to get metabolized. So if you can't burn it at the mitochondrial level, then you're not going to develop energy from that. And then your body then only will stick to carbohydrates, and carbohydrates burns really fast. It's like putting gasoline on a fire. When you run out of that, what happens? You crave more. Now, you start going to this downward spiral because as you run out of carbohydrates for energy and you can't tap into fats for energy, you crave more carbohydrates, which then puts more of an insulin load, which then creates more inflammation because your blood glucose goes a little higher. Because if you have more insulin around you become insulin desensitized. That becomes more of an opportunistic grounds for opportunistic infections. And elevated blood glucose is very toxic to the body. You leave this over time, you create more and more inflammation. This will create less and less oxygen being delivered, which means even more favorable environment for opportunistic infections. So one of the things that I utilize with patients to look at metabolic flexibility is that this little breathing thing called the lumen. It looks like my kids call it like a vaping thing because when they see me using it, they're like, "Dad, are you vaping?" No, it's a little device that measures the amount of carbon dioxide in your breath. And when your mitochondria are utilizing carbohydrates as fuel, they're releasing more carbon dioxide into your blood. When you're burning fat for energy, you release less carbon dioxide. So this little tool called the lumen will measure that carbon dioxide in your breath. And it'll basically tell you, are you burning carbohydrates or fat for energy? Pretty cool stuff. Now, over time, when you're more in a fat burning mode, you'll actually wake up in a state where you're burning fat for energy, and that'll show in your carbohydrate breath readout. And this is an overall reflection of your metabolic health status. Because if you're waking up consistently burning carbohydrates for energy, that's a sign that your mitochondria aren't where it's supposed to be. Now, you could have been born that way, obviously, or you could have done things that made your mitochondria not as happy along the way. If you woke up and you breathe into the lumen and you're in fat burning mode, that's really good because that indicates that you're in a state of high metabolic flexibility. That's where you want to be. So I use the lumen a lot with patients when we get into getting into metabolic flexibility. Now, in the grand scheme of things of whenever I put together protocols for patients, that's actually the last thing that we do. We don't work on metabolic flexibility right off the bat. We got to get towards the beginning part of getting the mitochondria back online. That's the biggest part, okay? Now, one other thing that the mitochondria does and is responsible for is cellular aging and DNA protection. And this is where we start to get into the talks about oncology, cancer, all of that stuff. And there's a lot of researchers that came out and talked about this big argument. Is cancer more of a genetic disease or is it more of a metabolic disease? And a lot of the signs actually point more towards it being a metabolic disease stemming straight from the mitochondria. That the mitochondria, when it's damaged, creates this whole thing called the Otto Warburg effect, which then will signal to the nucleus to turn on oncogenes or cancer genes as a protective mechanism, because it's basically going back to a primitive survival state, telling the cell, hey, we're in a state of less oxygen, therefore we need to conserve energy and we need to switch into a fermentative state. And fermentation is a primitive form of energy production. This is a survival mechanism and it should be used only short term. The problem becomes when we use it long term. That's when we run into a lot of the issues. So just note, because we'll talk about this more in other podcasts, that the mitochondria are very integral towards cancer development and also cancer reversals. Okay, enough talk about all that stuff. I know some people's brains are about to burst and their mitochondria in their brains are saying, okay guys, shut up. Just tell me, how am I going to help my body to function better? That's what you want to know, right? There's a bunch of things, but I'm going to narrow it down to some of the more applicable things that you can be doing to support your mitochondria, even helping it out to get it back in order. Number one thing is sunlight, especially morning sunlight, to reset the circadian rhythms, because the mitochondria are very light sensitive, and morning sunlight helps to reset the circadian rhythm in your body. Now, another thing that you want to be looking at is when you eat your meals, you want to eat it under either full spectrum light or something that doesn't have more predominantly blue light, okay? So dinner by candlelight is like the best, because this will reduce blood sugar spikes by over like 30%, okay? Your mitochondria really loves red light. And whenever you shine red light on the mitochondria, it makes, remember I told you that little thing that was at the end of the dam in the mitochondria called the ATP synthase? It's like a little, what they call a little nanomotor. When you shine red light on that thing starts to spin at almost 100% efficiency. That's crazy. Most engines are not even close to 100% efficiency. Yet this one is, especially when you shine red light on it. So you can get a lot of energy production just by shining red light on it. And when is the predominant red light being produced by the sun? In the mornings. So this is very important as far as mitochondrial function. Now, the crazy thing is that within your body will actually release light. Okay. So if we release light, we also should know that we need light as a nutrient. Now, if you have the time and energy, I would highly recommend reading the book Health and Light by John Ott. And he talks about how he would use different wavelengths of light, or just basically different colors, and its effect upon living organisms. And it's very fascinating. He worked for Disney and he utilized different colors, and it had an effect upon these plants. And we see that all around in life, especially like in marketing, right? If you look at in marketing, how companies use colors to represent certain things. Like, for example, a lot of fast food restaurants, they use red, orange, yellow, because those will stimulate digestion. Those stimulate the hunger, right? You have other companies that will stimulate different calming things like blues and greens. They seem more professional and all that kind of stuff. So like Facebook and all that stuff, or IBM, they would always use a different shade of blue. So color has an effect upon our body, but especially our mitochondria. And our mitochondria loves red light, okay? Blue light, on the other hand, will get those, I told you about the little assembly line, the proteins within the mitochondria. It makes those proteins farther spaced apart, and it makes the electron transport chain less efficient. So we still need blue light, but we got to balance that out with the red light. Okay. So just note that. So number one is light. Number two is utilizing cold and heat exposure. This is what we call a hormetic stressor. Stuff like cold showers, saunas, cryotherapy, ice baths, all those things will create a hormetic stress, meaning that when you apply these stressors, it creates a little bit of a discomfort for your body, which then creates more of a resiliency to those things. So the more you do it, exercising, lifting weights, the more you do it, the stronger you become. These will trigger the mitochondria to actually make more mitochondria. Okay? So if you want to have more energy, you need to have more mitochondria. And if you want to have more mitochondria, hormetic stress through cold and heat exposure is really important. So easy way to do heat exposure is contrast showers. So you would be in the shower, you would do 10 seconds of cold water followed by 20 to 30 seconds of warm water. And you do that maybe 5 to 10 cycles, end on the warm or hot water. Okay. Very easy way to do that. Number three is intermittent fasting, or also known as time-restricted eating, or known as chronological fasting or chronological fasting, because this is what promotes autophagy. Autophagy is basically your body's ability, or the way that it cleans up all the old cells. So any of the older cells that's just sticking around that should have been taken away, that hasn't been taken away, autophagy will clean it up. And fasting is what promotes autophagy. Whenever you do not have a lot of autophagy, you get more of these what's called senescent cells that sticks around. senescent cells will just do its own thing. It's not part of the pack anymore. It does its own thing. It sends out its own signals. And often these signals are not the signals you want. And one of the main signals that these senescent cells will send out is that of onco signals or cancer signals, right? So we want to implement fasting to implement autophagy to get rid of these cells so that we can basically have cleaner, younger cells. Now, in the process of fasting, you also will enter in a state of ketosis, and ketosis will produce bodies from the breakdown of fats. Now, the benefit of ketones is that it will upregulate what's called a sirtuin gene. These genes are the genes for longevity. Now, specifically, this one gene called the SIRT3 gene, this will control the flow of energy production in the mitochondria. Now, what happened was when they did studies on the ketogenic diet, intermittent fasting, they found that when your body got into a state of ketosis, you improved insulin sensitivity, you improved your triglyceride levels, you decreased inflammation, and you also increased the things that would protect the mitochondria. Okay? So doing time-restricted eating, intermittent fasting is very important. Now, I don't recommend this right off the bat for a person that's really stressed. So if you're really stressed out, and how do you know if you're really stressed out? You measure your heart rate variability, and I have a whole other talks about that. But if your heart rate variability is low, basically if you measure your heart rate variability and it's low, you know you're stressed out. And if you're stressed out, I wouldn't recommend doing intermittent fasting or the number 5 thing that we're going to talk about here. Sorry, skipping over 4, but number 5 is high intensity interval training. Those are the 2 things I wouldn't do if you're stressed out. Okay? So measure your heart rate variability. If you're good, then you can do intermittent fasting and know that you're going to help out your mitochondria. But if you're stressed out, do not do intermittent fasting or high intensity interval training. Now, number 4 is nutrients and supplements. This is the stuff that everybody likes. What kind of pill do I take to help my mitochondria, doc? One of the big ones is that you need an oil change. Yes, you need an oil change because most people have too much omega-6s in relation to omega-3s. And there's this thing called the omega-3 index, which measures the ratio between the two omega-3s and omega-6s. And most people have too high of omega-6s, which is pro-inflammatory. And this is why you see all the talk about avoiding seed oils, right? I'm not going to eat this because these have seed oils. This is where it comes from because it's throwing off the omega-3s. Omega-3s is predominantly anti-inflammatory and omega-6s is the inflammatory. Now, here's a crazy thing is going back to the whole light thing, right? Now, a question that I always get is, why does skin cancer happen to people that otherwise are generally healthy? And the reason for that is they have high inflammation because of an imbalance in the omega-3s and omega-6s. And if 1, you're underneath stress, and 2, you have a lot of inflammation, the interfaces of your body, okay, so your eyes, your skin, your lungs, your gut, all of those things will not work as advertised, okay? So you need to have an oil change and flip that omega-3 to omega-6 ratio to where you have more of an omega-3 dominance in your body. Now, it's very hard to get to that point, I understand. But if you keep at it, you're going to get there. So another caveat, because whenever I talk about omega-3s and getting an oil change, a lot of people, they automatically think, I need to take fish oil. Wrong. I do not recommend most fish oils. And the reason being is that most fish oils, 1, they're processed in the wrong way, so they're like not even effective. And 2, due to the fragile nature of the omega-3s, they become rancid when they're put on the shelf. So I always tell people, just get it straight from fish. Get it straight from fish. I've done tests to measure people's omega-3 index, and we looked at them just eating straight fish and other forms of omega-3s, and they got better anyway. So it's way more stable in that sense, and it's also a lot more delicious than just taking a pill that burp up fish stuff. So first thing is you need an oil change. Now, just from a general dietary nutrition perspective, like I said before, you got to lean more towards a ketogenic type of diet lifestyle to affect the mitochondria. You want to limit fructose intake, just overall lowering your blood glucose levels. You want to have a lot of amino acid rich food. But in order for you to get the benefit of that, you need a well-functioning gut. And if you haven't gone through my Total Gut Restore course, go through it. It has amazing things in there that no other gut protocol has. I can promise you that. This will clear out so much of the inflammation within your gut. Go through the course. If you don't know where it is, just DM me on Instagram and I can send you the link to that. Okay. Amino acid rich food, but you need a well-functioning gut because most people don't have enough stomach acid to digest the proteins to get to the amino acid state. So if you're just eating proteins and it's never digested fully into amino acids, then you're not doing yourself any good. And then you need a lot of fermented foods. Okay. So now let's talk about some supplementation. This is where everybody wants to start. Now, in regards to supplementation, CoQ10 is the obvious one. CoQ10 is one of the proteins that sits within the mitochondria. Now, you need the active form, which is called ubiquinol. And the dosage is somewhere between 100 to 400 milligrams per day. I just say if you really want to boost up mitochondrial function, take 100 milligrams 4 times a day with a fat-containing meal, okay? And then you also need some type of magnesium. So you got to decide which magnesium you need, whether it's like a magnesium citrate, glycinate, threonate, or magnesium oxide. Remember, magnesium oxide is the one that makes you go poop. So if you don't want to do that, or if you have trouble going poop, then that's your guy. Acetyl L-carnitine, I usually recommend 500 milligrams twice a day. D-ribose, 5 grams per day. Creatine is another big one that's misunderstood, by the way. 5 grams per day. Alpha-lipoic acid, 200 milligrams twice a day. Yeah, that's usually what I do. So alpha-lipoic acid. And then B vitamins, because B vitamins is just, you need that for just overall like the cold Krebs cycle and just overall energy function. Now, here's an interesting thing that not a lot of people think about. You've heard about MTHFR stuff, right? Everybody, that's like a big thing. You've heard other health gurus out there talk about methylation, and you need methylated form of B vitamins, which is great. Now, a lot of people are taking methylcobalamin. It's the methylated form of B12. Now, the interesting thing is that B12 in the form of methylcobalamin is stored primarily in the cytoplasm of the cell. So that's like the inside part of the cell, which is the outside part of the mitochondria. It's outside of the mitochondria. Now, if you actually wanted to help the mitochondria, the form of B12 that you'd want to take is actually called adenosylcobalamin. That's what you need for the mitochondria. So a lot of people are actually taking just methylcobalamin, which is great because it helps with the whole methylation issue. But if you want to help the mitochondria, you need adenosylcobalamin. Okay. Now, there are other things, PQQ, NAD boosters. I always recommend this basic protocol for all my patients. Protandim NRF1 and NRF2 ion and molecular hydrogen. This complex right here, it will supercharge your mitochondria, supercharge your body, right? So NRF1 helps with mitochondrial biogenesis or making more mitochondria. NRF2 helps with oxidative stress and inflammation. Will take care of the cellular voltage, boosting the cellular voltage, pH levels, extracellular pH, all that stuff. And molecular hydrogen is a selective antioxidant that deals with the hydroxyl and peroxynitrite oxides and all of those types of free radicals. Okay. So when you got those 4 things into place, you have a powerhouse for your mitochondria. Okay. So that's like the basics. There's a lot more things we can get into with the nutrition aspect and supplements for it, but we'll leave that for another day. Number 5, we alluded to this earlier, which is high intensity interval training or zone 2 cardio. Basically, high intensity interval training will create and stimulate more mitochondria. So do some high intensity interval training. We'll talk about the whole protocols for that in another podcast. Number 6 is balancing out the gut. And the reason for this is the microbiome. You want to balance out the microbiome because you want to improve one particular strain called Akkermansia, because Akkermansia will improve the production of mitochondria or mitochondrial biogenesis. So I use a product called the Mind-Body GLP-1 system. And you may have heard about GLP-1 like Ozempic. And now your body actually produces GLP-1 and is produced in the gut. Now the Mind-Body system helps the production and increases the production. And we have a lot of clinical studies that show that we increase GLP-1 production a lot using the Mind-Body system, particularly Akkermansia. And the one thing that I'm really excited about the Mind-Body system is that it increases and helps to support mitochondrial growth. Now, balancing out the gut will also decrease systemic inflammation. And one of the things that we don't necessarily think about is LPS, or lipopolysaccharides. This is an endotoxin from the cell walls of a lot of the bacteria that reside within the gut. When these start floating around and it's not metabolized properly, or there's an excessive amount or an imbalance in the gut microbiome, you have more LPS floating around, which creates more inflammation. So balancing out the gut is very important. And when I've talked about this till the cows come home, but this is more stuff that I don't think I've ever talked about before. And then number 7 is obvious, minimize environmental toxins, because environmental toxins will disrupt chondrial energy production, especially electrons, because basically the definition of a toxin is something that interferes or steals electrons. That's basically what it does. All right, so we made it through this episode. But here's what I want you to take away from this episode today is that you have a mitochondrial legacy that was passed down from your mom. And what you do today will either strengthen it or it'll weaken that. And I gave you the tools to help strengthen that. And I gave you all the things that will weaken it as well. So stay away from those things. Now, the good news out of all of this is that the mitochondria are adaptable. They've survived a long time. They respond to what you eat, what you do, even what you think. So that's for another episode as well. Now, so if you've been feeling like sluggish, tired, not quite yourself, it might not be just like you. It may not be like you're losing the motivation and all that kind of stuff. It just be a sign that your mitochondria is waving a little white flag and saying, I give up, I need help. Okay, this is your sign basically to just start nourishing those little guys because they power everything in your life. And they started with your mother's gift to you. So if you love this episode, share it with someone who could use an energy reboot. Subscribe to this for more empowering health stories and science-backed tips. And if you want to dive into, or a deeper dive into mitochondrial health, consider checking out our Thrive 120 community. And there's a lot of information on there. Just go to Instagram and send me a message with the keyword T120, or just go on the website. Go to tripleplayperformance.com/T120. You can read all about the community there, and we'd love to have you as a community member and contributing to that. But till the next time, this is Dr. Mike saying be well and aloha.